Cover the last two chapters in our final message in this series on the book of Esther. We started our series about 2 months ago, and as we started the series, I just mentioned, oftentimes when we think about the big, bold nature of God, the very visible presence of God being seen in the world, we often think of the Old Testament. We think of how God has been publicly on display in just so many different ways. You think about, for instance, Moses. You think about Moses and the burning bush, or Moses and the 10 plagues that came upon Egypt, and or perhaps Moses and the parting of the Red Sea. You think about all kinds of big, bold, public displays of God. You think about God giving the 10 Commandments as he thunders from the mountain. It's just amazing things throughout the Old Testament. You get to the New Testament and you think about Jesus, right? And you think about his presence. You could see him, you could touch him, you could hear him, and you're like, God in the flesh come to dwell among us. Amazing. And then the church age and God working through the power of the Spirit, beginning in the book of Acts, and you see major transformations. But as you fast forward to today, you're like, man, it's just like, it seems awfully quiet. You go, I don't see big, bold, public displays of amazing transformation necessarily, certainly on a regular basis, right? And what I love as we get back into the book of Esther today and we finish out the series is this is a book found in the Old Testament, that place of big, bold God on display. It's this book in the Old Testament where God's name isn't mentioned one time, where he seems absent and silent in some very specific ways, but in other ways, as readers, we're encouraged to look and read and see that God is present. He's powerfully at work, but it's all behind the scenes. It's the providential hand of God, the invisible hand of God, not the miraculous, powerfully overt hand of God. It's this covert action, behind the scenes God working in providential ways. And it causes us as readers, it causes us as a church to have to look for it, to have to be attentive to it. And one of the prayers, two of the prayers really that I mentioned from the beginning of our series is my prayer for me and my prayer for us as a church is that we would grow in the ability to see God. Like, don't you want to see God and see his hand at work? God's working, but it's predominantly in a providential, behind-the-scenes way. We have to look for it. We have to be more and more skilled at seeing it in this invisible way, this invisible hand of God, and we often fail to. And so the book of Esther encourages us to grow in our ability to see God's hand providentially at work. And then secondly, more on the application side of it, it's to know God in such a way, to know that he is present, to, by faith, see that he's faithful, and to, instead of leaning into our own strength and doing things our own way, it's to lean into him, right? We've used this phrase, to depend on the God who defends us. God is a God who makes promises. God is a God who is present, and in life, we want to lean into him rather than away from him. So this call to depend on the God who defends us. We see in the book of Esther, and we get there today, this part of the main book, part of the main purpose of Esther is to explain why do the Jews feast and yearly celebrate this event called Purim? Why? Well, Esther tells us why. It gives us the origin of this celebration, this deliverance of God in amazing ways, dramatic ways in the book of Esther. And we've been witnessing that chapter by chapter, right? That God has been at work in this pagan land, even among Jews who didn't go back to Jerusalem after the captivity of Babylon ended. They're still there, and the Medes and the Persians are ruling. And this kind of wild king, King Ahasuerus, King Xerxes, two names that describe this king. He is this one who's ruling, and God's at work in the midst of all of the ups and downs that we see in the book of Esther. Now, as we come to the last couple chapters here, chapter 9, verse 1 starts in this very dramatic way. It says, in the 12th month, on the 13th day of the month. Like, this is like that specific day where it's all going to go down, right? There's two edicts we've heard about, these two decrees. One is to annihilate all the Jews, and the other is all the Jews defend yourself. And we finally come to this dramatic day that the book of Esther has been pointing to all the way along, and we're going to find out what actually happens on that day. You see, it's interesting, and we think we've seen God turning the tide in dramatic ways. In fact, at the end of chapter 8, the Jews celebrate, right? Because there's a new decree rather than the one just to destroy them, but perhaps they've celebrated too soon, right? What's actually going to happen on that day? You see, evil and anti-Semitism doesn't just die with a law being written, right? We see actually attacks take place. And what happens on this specific day as we read Esther 9 and 10. Let's read them. We'll walk into this and seek to see God and see how this celebration of victory takes place. Esther chapter 9 starts this way. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that his enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officers, the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man, Mordecai, became increasingly prominent. Thus, the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also, this is if anyone wants to read this part, you can read. Okay, no, I'll keep going. Also, Parshandatha, Dalphin, Aspenath, Panatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aradai, and Vajazetha, and the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan the citadel was brought to the king, and the king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow, according to today's decree. And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." And so the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed 300 men of Shushan, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Shushan assembled together on the 13th day, as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who dwell in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and fasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, for that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast Pur, that is Lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions, according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom, and Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. And King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might, and the account of his greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen. Here's a text that, again, reminds us to see God. That's where I want to start with you in this passage, to see God and see his providence, to grow in the ability to see his invisible hand, right? We want to know God. We want to see him. We want to see what he's done. You see, God is a God of amazing reversals. We see it in just a profound way in this text. He's able to take what seems impossible and turn it into that which is possible, right? He's done it so many times in history, and he does it again in this text, right? We could give pretty much countless examples, right? He takes a barren Sarah and Abram, and he promises to them, I will make of you a great nation. Well, how is that going to happen? She can't have one child, let alone a multitude of children. And what does God do? God brings about the impossible with Abram and Sarah. He takes those where Moses goes to slaves in Egypt and says, your God's going to set you free. And they're like, are you kidding me? Right? This is not going to happen. Right? And what does God do? He brings them out with power so that as they leave, the Egyptians are handing them their treasures. And you're going, that seems like it would never happen. And it happens. Right? God uses a lowly shepherd boy to defeat a giant with a sling and a few stones. Right? And he becomes the great king of Israel. God takes a woman named Mary, a lowly person and makes her the mother of the Messiah. God does impossible things. He is the God of possibility. He is the God of reversals. And this is, again, an example of it in our text, that God can make what is impossible possible. He is a God of reversals. And as we look at our text today in Esther 9 and 10, I want to give you what I think here. The emphasis is not necessarily just on the ability of God. Yes, God is able, right? God is able to do the impossible. God is able to reverse. He is powerful in that way. The text certainly puts that on display, but I would submit to you, it's not as much about the ability of God as it is the reliability of God. Is God reliable? Can we trust Him when that dark day comes? When what seems like that which is totally impossible? Can I look to Him? Does it cause me to be bold in my faith to live it out in the midst of a king who, why would he listen to me, right? Esther shows you the reliability of God, I think even more than his ability. Not just his ability, but his reliability. If you think back to God and his promises, I mentioned just a moment ago the story in Genesis 12 where God speaks. He calls out a family. He speaks to, at this point, just a husband and wife, Abram and Sarah. Barren Sarah, by the way. We mentioned that, right? This is this promise that God makes. I am going to make of you a great nation. Can God do that? Well, yeah, He started it. He preserved them in Egypt. He's brought them here. He's brought them out of captivity in Babylon. But what about these that didn't go back? What about these who are still in the pagan land, the capital of the Medes and the Persians? What about them? Has God forgotten His people? Is God reliable to His promises? Is this key question through the book of Esther. Does He love even these stragglers that stay behind? Is He going to be merciful to them like He's been merciful to Nehemiah and the building of the wall back in Jerusalem? What's going to happen to these who are scattered abroad throughout the province of King Ahasuerus? These 127 provinces emphasized several times in our passage today. You see, in our text, God's proving once again that He's reliable. Yes, He's able, but is He going to be reliable to you? Is He going to be reliable to Esther and the Jews scattered abroad in our passage here? He is reliable. He can be trusted. Esther puts that on display, causes us as a reader to look into the details about how God is reliable. How does He show His faithfulness? Let me give you two things here in our passage. As God turns the tide, even as this day falls in our text. What are the specific ways that God shows that He's faithful? The first thing I'd say to you in the opening verses here is the fame of Mordecai. Verse 3 speaks about it. That these government officials, why do they show favor to the Jews as they're scattered abroad in all these provinces? Why do all these government officials, why do they side with the Jews here? The text tells us, right? The text tells us in verse 3 that the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. The text tells us that God, in very specific ways, how did He show that He was reliable? He exalted and brought fame to this guy Mordecai, a fame that spread out around the empire in a very short time span. If you were with us last week, we read about, it was just about 8 months before this day falls that Mordecai rose to power. They didn't have social media to spread the news about Mordecai. They didn't, but this message gets to them about this new edict, and somehow all these different government officials throughout the entire empire, this vast empire of King Ahasuerus, hear more and more and more about this guy Mordecai. His rise to power, His fame is spread, and there's this respect and fear about this guy, Mordecai, that causes them, when this day falls, which side? These two edicts, remember? Totally opposite of each other. Kill them all and let them defend themselves. Well, what's more advantageous to you? Remember the promise when in chapter 3, when Haman makes the promise of killing them all is, hey, you can plunder them and get very, very rich. Well, here in our passage, they side with who? They side with these two opposing edicts. They side to preserve and protect the Jews. Why? Because God, somehow in these short 8 months, has exalted the fame of Mordecai in such a way that they fear this man in his rise to power. God is behind it, right? God is amazingly about this. I mentioned we don't have social media. It's kind of surprises me in our day and age what goes viral. Sometimes you're like, and even back in my day, it's like one of those we used to fold up our shirt sleeves or twist our pants and fold them up, and you're like, who made that cool? Just in the recent Olympics, you're like, why in the world does this middle-aged Turkish man, why does this shooter, why does he go public? You're like, why does this weird Australian lady who gets 0 at the Olympics in breakdancing, why in the world does her videos go viral? You're like, what in the world causes certain things to just pop, right? And other things to just be lost in cyberspace, right? I don't know how. I'm not describing God behind those two viral things recently for us, but I am telling you in this passage, we can't help but see God caused Mordecai to go viral. God caused him to go abroad, and that is what our text says, one of the key ways that God preserved his people, the fame of Mordecai. God can use things like that to preserve his people, to keep his promises, to see an exact reversal go about. It's amazing in our text that God brings about a great victory through his people, and specifically through this fame, this fear that Mordecai has brought about in all these nations spread abroad. Chapter 9, verse 5 says about the Jews as they defend themselves. It says they did whatever they wanted, it says. And I want you to understand here in this text, it's over and over again we see the Israelites defending themselves from some of these attackers who are going to go with the first edict, not the second. In this text, verse 5 says the Israelites did whatever they wanted. I want you to understand, this is not saying that Israel is going to go crazy and just slaughter. What they're doing is defending themselves, but the author of Esther has said it in such a way that it's, again, exact reversal of what was said earlier. In chapter 3, verse 11, Haman, in his first edict, has said, do whatever you want to them. Right? This idea of the first edict, do whatever you want, and here we see this exact reversal. They did. They overpowered. They conquered when those around them were trying to conquer them. Speaking of the utter success that they had in defending themselves. But I want you to notice also the aspect of restraint throughout this passage. 3 times in our passage it emphasizes they did not take of the plunder. So when they defended themselves, they're not going in and stealing everything from those people who sought to attack them. And I want you to notice in the previous chapter, in fact, the second edict, again, was exact opposite of the first edict, that they could plunder, just like the first edict said, you can plunder the Jews. But I want you to notice that they do not do that, as our text emphasizes 3 times in chapter 9. And I'm going to spend time in a church family hour talking about that aspect of holy war, dedicating things as unto the Lord and not taking plunder. It's an important aspect of the defining lines between these two approaches to battle here in our text. So the first thing here in our text is specifically, how does God work? He works through the fame of Mordecai. Secondly, in our text, he works through the favor of Esther. The favor of Esther. here in the passage, it goes on to talk about Esther. Verses 11 and following, we see the king going before her and asking her what she wants. And she, in verse 13, asks for an extension to this chance to defend themselves. Remember back in chapter 4, Esther was challenged to step into her role that perhaps God has put her here for such a time as this. That amazing phrase back in chapter 4. And we were kind of like, I think that's probably why these opening chapters take place, to where now we get to chapter 4. But we're like, I think so, maybe. But by this chance in the book, we're like, definitively yes, right? God certainly has put Esther here in the kingdom for such a time as this. It's orchestrated evidence upon evidence upon evidence. God is behind the scenes here doing this. God has caused Esther so many times in our book to hear the king say, whatever you want, whatever you want, whatever you want. Well, here it is again in our passage. She's truly gained favor for such a time as this. And again, God's behind that, right? You see in our text here, verse 11 and following, the Jews were successful in the capital there of Susa or Shushan there. They're successful there, but it's like one of those, remember Joshua prays that God will keep the sun in the sky for the victory to be completed in the book of Joshua. It's kind of like that here in our text. It's like they're having victory, but the victory's not finished. There's not a completion of the battle. And so Esther asks in our text, would you extend it a day so that we can have full and final victory about all those who are opposing? And so the king does what? Because God has given the favor of Esther before the king, God again grants this request. The king allows it here in our passage, and they defend themselves the second day and have great victory in the capital, like they've had out in the surrounding regions where there's no walled cities. It's amazing here in our text, and this is why there's a 2-day celebration. It kind of explains what happened, and it explains why that they have a 2-day celebration. But as you look for God in the book of Esther, as you look for God in this passage through the fame of Mordecai and the favor of Esther, we see once again, God is at work here in the specific details. God's at work to defend his people. And it's one of those things where when the day falls, when this dark day of like, are they going to be destroyed or are they going to have success in defending themselves? What's going to happen? We see that God is there, that God is reliable. He's not just able, but he's reliable as they're able to have success, that their hope is in him, that they're to lean into him, to depend on the God who defends them. But what does it lead to? Our text, it leads to this celebration. It leads to this celebration of victory. So I want to just think with you about this, not just seeing God, but celebrating him, remembering him, not letting this seeing God go to waste and forgetting about him, but this aspect of remembering him, of celebrating his victory. It leads to feasting in our passage. The end of chapter 9, verse 17, it leads to feasting. There's a day of feasting and gladness. It leads to verse 18, where the Jews assembled together. And as they do so, they made a day of feasting and gladness, verse 18. This repeated over and over again, feasting and gladness. This verse 19, they're giving presents to each other. They're celebrating this community aspect of they gather together and they remember and celebrate and have joy with each other is what takes place here. And then in the last part of chapter 9, Mordecai and Esther make this an official holiday. That's what takes place in our passage. You see, throughout the book of Esther, we've seen several times, we've seen this specific details of palace protocol. Remember, you can't go before the king, you'll die unless he holds out his scepter. We've seen various aspects of temple protocol. Well, the end of the book here says to us, repeatedly, Mordecai does this, Esther comes along and reinforces it, and then it's written down in the book. Officially, Purim has now become an official holiday. It's kind of like Columbus Day is coming up in a couple weeks. And at some point, it was just, there was a celebration of, but at one point, 1937, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he's the one who makes that an official holiday, writes it in the book, and it becomes official for our land. We celebrate this holiday, right? That's what takes place in our passage. This victory has happened. This days of feasting have been caused to happen, but the call is, don't forget it. Don't forget what God has done. Remember it, and there's this call to do it every year. We pause, and we give gifts, and it's kind of cool. As they make it official, they'll say, don't just give gifts to each other, but give gifts to the poor. You notice that in verse number 22, right? You give gifts to the lowly. We were lowly. What could have been the darkest day of our existence and our extermination, and God brought life and joy and feasting out of it. And it's this amazing reversal, even found in the name. Remember, back in chapter 3, I believe it is, as this takes place, Haman, remember the evil guy in our story, Haman gets this edict, this permission to an edict, and he's drafting it up with his officials, and what does he do? He rolls the dice to find out when it's going to take place. And it ends up rolling to the 12th month, right? The month of Adar. So they cast Pur. In the Hebrew, they cast Pur. That's a lot. They roll the dice, and the double sixes land, right? 12. And here we go. We've got 12, the 12th month, and that's when this is going to take place. And so as they celebrate it, it's this, I don't know, kind of being funny a little bit. They're like, we're going to celebrate Purim. You cast the dice, and what takes place. It's like Proverbs 16:33. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Proverbs 16:33. This is the people of Israel. They go, you can cast lots, but who's in control of that? God is. Not just in the number, but God is in control of the outcome. Right? That's what God does, this God of reversals. And then as we turn to chapter 10 here. Chapter 10, if there's an ending of a book in the Bible where the cowboy rides off into the sunset, and you're like, oh, and they lived happily ever after, it's kind of this book right here, right? In our book here, we're like, King Ahasuerus, he's thriving, and it's because his second in command now, Mordecai, is this dude who is just doing well. He's serving the people. It says here, he was great among the Jews and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. He was a servant leader who God used to bless others, right? As our passage ends, this picture of thriving, right? This picture of God powerfully working in. We've seen it in Esther and Mordecai and our heroes of the story, that God can work mightily, cause amazing reversals when these two will follow the Lord. God loves to pour out his blessing. The people who will surrender to him. I think of a famous quote by D.L. Moody. It says this: the world has yet to see what God can do with a man fully consecrated to him. D.L. Moody. The world is yet to see what God can do with a man fully consecrated to him. And the finish of the quote, D.L. Moody says, by God's help, I aim to be that man. I want to be used by God. Is that something you would say? As you think about the book of Esther, as you think about your own life, you go, God, I see how two people can reverse the fortunes of a kingdom, an entire people. Yes, God was behind it, but what did he do? He used these two who are willing to believe him, who are willing to trust him, who are willing to follow him when everything looked dark and against them. The world is yet to see what God can do with a man fully consecrated to him. Right? The pull throughout the book of Esther is, can God be trusted? Can we depend on him? And the point is, if God can be trusted, if we can trust him for his promises, he's worth believing in the worst of times and the best of times. Right? The point is, if God is who he is, if you see him for who he really is, then it really won't matter whether your day is good or it's bad. That we'll learn to trust him. We'll learn to depend upon him. And we won't let it fade from our minds. We won't forget about it. We'll keep it in front of us like they do here. Celebrate his victory. Remember to do so regularly. We are people prone to forget. We're people that tend to go our own way and maybe be silent so that we don't get wrapped up in all this stuff over here, right? We're prone to forget. God wants to drive you to feasting and doing it in community so we don't forget about him. But we continue to teach our hearts to know him and trust him, to depend upon him. I would just encourage you, no matter how bad things get. In fact, especially when things get really bad, God can be trusted. God keeps his promises. He is not only able to, but he is reliable to keep his promises. So, what's the call? The call is to trust him. The call is to depend on him. Live right now in light of who he is. If he is dependable, then depend upon him. Don't let yourself forget about it. Feast upon his victories. Do it in community. Remember him. Don't forget about who he is and what he's done. Let me pray with you. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the chance to celebrate these truths together. What amazing truths. And God, I just pray, because it's really whatever we're facing. Some people here are going through some dark difficulties. Others are getting promotions and life's grand right now. And Lord, whatever that is, the point of rejoicing or weeping that we find ourselves in, the book of Esther shows us a God who's reliable. He is faithful. You, God, are that God. You are the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so, God, would you teach us, would you help us to know you, to see you, like Esther communicates it to us? And would you help us to depend upon you? To boldly live for you in a world that's not a friend to your name. Help us, God, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.